Okay, Gabriella, we ready?
Yes, should I thought you wanted to say a couple words?
Yeah, no, I will. I just wanted to make sure you were ready with everything else. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Sorry about the technical issues, but I think we're in good shape now. I'm Andrew Chignell. I'm happy to be one of the co-organizers of the Virtual Congress, along with Karin de Boer, who's also here. And we're looking forward today to the episode closest, I think, to Kant's actual birthday. Kant is now 300 years and 7 days old. The birthday was a week ago today. And the panel that we have is a very exciting one, curated by the Società Italiana di Studi Kantiani, the Italian Kant Society, on new perspectives on Kant from young Italian Kant scholars. And to host this, I'll turn it over to Gabriella Gava, professor at University of Torino. Gabriella.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and also the other organizer of the virtual Kant Congress for inviting us to organize a session. We are really happy to be part of this series. Yeah, so so we have chosen to give this space to a young scholar, young Italian scholar who are producing some interesting work on Kant. And in particular, the speakers today will be Lorenzo Sala from the University of Milan and Jessica Segesta from the University of Palermo. So the talk will be approximately 30 minutes, and then we will go immediately to discussion for each paper. And there has been a change in the order of the talk. So we will start with Jessica Segesta. So I'll start presenting her. So Jessica is a postdoc at the University of Palermo. She has recently got her PhD from the University of Messina and with a joint degree with the University of Heidelberg. And her talk today is entitled Ontology as Immanent Thinking and the Concept of Transcendental Objectivity. So Jessica, the floor is yours. I'll start sharing.
Thank you, Gabriella. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So many thanks to Gabriella and of course to all the organizers of this event. I would also like to say thanks to the board of the Società Italiana di Studi Kantiani for choosing me, for giving me this opportunity today. So you see, I prepare also PowerPoint presentation, but it's only with the text that I will quote during my talk. So the title is Ontology as Immanent Thinking and the Concept of Transcendental Objectivity. The talk is devoted to Kant's new accounts of ontology, and more specifically to the role that the theory of the transcendental objects plays in it. Firstly, I'll provide a very, very brief overview of Kant's definition of ontology as immanent thinking, so what it does mean. And afterward, I will delve into the Kantian theory of the transcendental object, as presented in the first edition of Critique of Reason. And at the end, so in the end, I will propose my personal interpretation of the concept of transcendental objects, which I think is aligns with the fundamental assumption of Kant's formal idealism and its empirical realism. So the first slide in the PowerPoint presentation, if you, Gabriella, can you change the page? Okay. This is, of course, Kant's letter to Beck from the 1792. is the letter where Kant presents the ontology, a whole science of ontology as immanent thinking. So I read just the last two sentences. Here I shall always remark that such objects can be represented by us only as given in space and time. Out of this, there emerges a whole science of ontology as immanent thinking, namely a science of things, the objective reality of whose concept can be securely established. So, in this letter to Beck, Kant speaks as a whole in science of ontology as immanent thinking, as thinking through concept that can be securely established as having objective reality. According to Kant's assertion in the Critique of Reason, as we know, this must be undertaken without invoking any dogmatic reference to transcendental entities or alleged objects. This reality will be assumed to exist outside the sensible realm of our possible experiences. For Kant, ontology indeed no longer assumes the dogmatic form of knowledge that aims to know all things in general, namely regardless or whether they are given the sensible intuition or another kind of intuition. According to him, ontology takes the profile of an inquiry that is concerned only and exclusively with that is given to our senses, what can be intuited by us, the aim of which is to determine a priori whether or not there are possible objects of knowledge. In this regard, it is noteworthy that in the first edition, the Critique of Reason, Kant employed the expression representation of things in general, or Vorstellungen der Dinge überhaupt, whereas in the second edition, he prefers the expression concept of an object in general, so Begriffe des Gegenstandes überhaupt, in order to refer to the pure representation of our intellect, namely to the notions of ontology. For Kant, this is a kind, namely the ontology, is a kind of scientific knowledge that is possible only in the context of the empirical use of those forms of our thought, the core concept or understanding, that have the original capacity to transcend the particular nature of the data of our empirical intuition, but only to determine their general objectivity. Kant's ontological system is composed of all that concept and principle, as Kant said, that are related to objects in general, without assuming objects that will be given, so ohne Objekte anzunehmen, die gegeben wären. These are concepts and principles that are a priori constitutive of a general model of objectivity that does not find its correspondence in a nominal reality that lies entirely outside the sensible realm of our cognition. Instead, this model serves as a criterion or as a rule for determining the ontological value of possible experiences, which are always empirical. So in my view, this is the context in which the meaning and also the ambiguity of the Kantian concept of a transcendental object must be framed and can be correctly understood. So let's see what Kant say about this concept in the first edition of the Critique of Reason. As we already know, Kant introduced the theory of the transcendental objects in the text of the first edition of the Transcendental Deduction of the Categories, in the section called On the Synthesis of Recognition in the Concept. Here, the notion of the transcendental object is called into question for a very specific reason, to explain what exactly is meant when one speaks of an object corresponding to the cognition. As Martin Heidegger already emphasizes in his text Kant und das Problem der Metaphysik, The fact that Kant poses such a question here is a clear indication that in the context of the new transcendental philosophy, the same notion of the correspondence to objects of our knowledge, namely what makes this knowledge objective, needs to be completely reconsidered. So this is the passages of the first edition of the Critique.
Jessica, sorry if I interrupt. Just tell me when I need to change slide because I'm not sure I'm tracking.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry. But it was the perfect time.
Okay, so that's fine. Okay, good.
Yeah. No, this is you have to go back to the.
Okay, you're still on this.
Other.
Okay, great.
No, the second one. Sorry, Gabriele. Sorry.
So this one, right?
This one, yeah. So we have said above that appearances themselves are nothing but sensible representations, said Kant, which must not be regarded in themselves in the same way as objects, outside the power of representation. So what does one mean then if one speaks of an object corresponding to and therefore also distinct from the cognition? It's easy to see that these objects must be thought of only as something in general. Since outside of our cognition, we have nothing that we could set over against this cognition as corresponding to it. So the first thing that Kant argues here is that the object that corresponds to our representation must necessarily be different from them and therefore can only be thought by us as something in general. So as an indeterminate object whose nature remains completely unknown to us. Kant repeats this idea in another key passages from the first edition of the Critique of Reason. If you can change, Gabriele.
Yes.
In 253, Kant writes, the object to which I relate appearance in general is the transcendental object, idem as the entirely undeterminate thought of something in general, der gänzlich unbestimmte Gedanken von etwas überhaupt. So in these passages, Kant argues that objects that correspond to a representation can only be thought as something in general, and that the nature of this thought remains fully or totally undeterminate. It is important to keep in mind, however, that the profile of indeterminacy that characterized the notion of something in general, etwas überhaupt, is for Kant not absolute but empirical, despite the formulas he uses here. It is, in other words, an indeterminacy opposes to that which characterizes the possible objects of our intuition, namely the appearances. It is not a coincidence, from my point of view, that Kant introduced the concept of transcendental objects in contrast to them, to the appearances.
I think, hold on one second, Jessica. I think the microphone on your earpiece is rubbing against your shirt or something, and so we're getting a lot of feedback noise. Is there a way to just make sure the microphone isn't rubbing against anything?
I can do this. No,
if it's not
okay,
too uncomfortable, is it too uncomfortable to hold it? It does sound a lot better, yeah.
Okay.
Is it okay?
No, it's not a problem.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Gabriele, if you can change the, okay. Here Kant say these appearances are nothing in themselves, but themselves only representation, which in turn have their object, which therefore cannot be further intuited by us, and that may therefore be called the non-empirical transcendental object. So this contrast, in my opinion, reveals a fundamental aspect of the transcendental object. It indicates that we can know what the transcendental object is. It remains completely unknown to us, as Kant often states, only because it is not an object that we can intuit like any other empirical object. In contrast to the thing in itself, which is unknowable by its definition, the transcendental object is indeed unknowable because it cannot be given within the form of our sensible intuition like any other object. In the second quote, in fact, we can read the transcendental object is equally unknown in regard to inner and to outer sense. Regarding this aspect, I agree, for example, with Paola Vasconi. She said in one essay entitled La cosa in sé e la doppia affezione in Kant that the transcendental object is of our representation, unlike the thing in itself, is unknowable not in principle but de facto. It is important to note, in fact, that the assertion that the transcendental object is not something that is actually given the pure form of space and time, so in the form of outer and inner sense, does not imply that it corresponds to an external reference of a transcendent nature. From my perspective, it is of utmost importance to clarify this point if you want to understand the true meaning and the fundamental role that the transcendental objects play in Kant's ontology. It is first and foremost necessary to keep in mind that when Kant speaks of the transcendental object as the object that corresponds to our representation, is invoking a very specific idea of correspondence that is the result of the Copernican revolution. This is an idea of correspondence or objectivity that cannot be traced back to the classical notion of adequatio rei et intellectus. Kant's theory of the transcendental object serves to clarify this point. It served namely to show that in the context of the new transcendental philosophy, or in context of the new ontology, speaking of an object corresponding to a representation does not mean referring, to something whose reality is completely independent of us, namely to something that is given outside of our power representation. Gabriele, if you can change the slide. This is the reflection 55-54. Kant introduces the concept of transcendental object for the first time. He say, noumeno means above all this, namely the transcendental object of sensible intuition. This, however, is not a real object or given, but a concept in relation to which appearances have unity. For it must be correspond to something, even though we know nothing but the appearance of it. We cannot say, however, that the pure categories have objects, but they merely determine the transcendental objects in relation to our sensibility by the synthesis of the manifold of intuition. So I think this first description already offers a clarification of the fact that Kant's characterization of the transcendental objects as the objects of our representation is not in contrast with its qualification as the intelligible cause or intelligibile Ursache of them. The concept of transcendental object is indeed identified by Kant as that which allows us to think the unity of our empirical representation, which would otherwise be expressed in the subjective form of a mere rhapsody. And it is precisely this thought, namely thought of their unity, that according to Kant would give them an objective value. So from the very beginning, Kant brought in the theory of the transcendental into play to show that the reference or the relation of our representation to an object should be reconsidered in the sense of a necessary correlation that can be thought between the same representation. This is the idea that Kant further develops and clarifies in the Critique of Reason. If you can change the slide, Gabriele. So this is what Kant say in the first edition of the Transcendental Deduction of the Categories. He writes, we find, however, that our thought of the relation of all cognition to its object carries something of necessity with it, since namely the latter is regarded as that which is opposed to our cognition, beyond determined at pleasure or arbitrary, rather than determined a priori, since insofar as they are to relate to an object, our cognition must also necessarily agree with each other in relation to it. They must have that unity, say Kant, that constitute the concept of an object. So in these passages, Kant suggests that if we consider the object as that which opposes to the merely arbitrary and contingent determination of our knowledge, and consider the relation to it as the binding reference to a reality that is given as completely independent of us, namely in itself, we can rethink the necessary relation to an object in terms of a necessary agreement between our representation. In terms, said otherwise, that make the first kind of necessity comprehensible or intelligible for us, to us. Kant writes that the concept of transcendental object, can you change the slide, Gabriele? Cannot contain any determinate intuition at all, and therefore concern nothing but the unity which must be encountered in a manifold of cognition insofar as it stands in relation to an object. And this unity, Kant adds, is nothing else than the necessary unity of consciousness, thus also of the synthesis of the manifold through a common function of the mind for combining it in one representation. In his essay, Kant und das Ding an sich, Heidegger considered the above passages from the first edition of the Transcendental Deduction of the Categories to argue that the concept of the transcendental objects starts Kant to express the need to exclude from the a priori condition of the possibility of experience any kind of reference to entity of a transcendent nature. According to Heidegger, the concept of the transcendental object, which functions as a kind of substitute or doppelganger for the notion of the thing in itself in the context of Kant's new epistemology. With this concept, Kant's philosophy would indeed express the need to rethink the objectivity of our cognition in terms of their necessary relation to the original synthetic unity of a perception. Otherwise, in terms that are immanent to it. This passage is taken from Heidegger's text. The transcendental deduction of the categories is read concerned with the purely immanent a priori condition from which the objectivity and the unity of the experiential knowledge results. There is no place at all in it for the concept of something transcendental. This is exactly what the concept of the transcendental object is supposed to express. It arises only from the consideration that the concept of the thing in itself is quite unsuitable for solving the task in question. And in her most recent essay, published in the latest issue of Studi Critici, Professor Kari de Boer argues that Kant deliberately breaks the rule of mind-independent things so as to shift the focus entirely to the relationship between representation and their mind-immanent objects. She also argues that within Kant's new transcendental philosophy, when we talk about objects of cognition, we are always referring to a mind-immanent product of cognitive activity to which concept can be referred. So, from my point of view, the sense of immanence that characterized the Kantian concept of the transcendental object in the Critique of Reason is in some way even more radical than that. And it is related to its coessential reference to the sensible data of our empirical intuition. Can you change the slide, Gabriele? Thank you. Kant, in fact, argues that the concept of transcendental object would not be even conceivable or thinkable without reference to this kind of data. He said, all our representations are related to some object through the understanding, and since appearances are nothing but representation, the understanding thus relates them to a something as the object of sensible intuition. But this something is that to extend only the transcendental object. This signifies, however, a something of which we know nothing at all, nor can know anything in general in accordance with the current constitution of our understanding, but is rather something that can serve only as a correlate of the unity of our perception for the unity of the manifold insensible intuition, by means of which the understanding unified that in the concept of an object. This transcendental object cannot even be separated from the sensible data, for then nothing will remain through which it would be thought. I guess that most scholars have not paid enough attention to the emblematic sense of this reference to the sensible data, to the sinnliche data, namely to the empirical matter of our sensible intuition. This reference indeed reveals what I think is the true sense of immanence that characterizes the concept of the transcendental object. It is essential. It is namely its essential relation to the idealistically pure dimension of our intuition, its spatio-temporal forms, within which the possibility of data is properly given. As mentioned above, the transcendental object theory allowed Kant to rethink the objective value of our representation by reacting the idea that the ontological guarantee is some transcendental real entity that lies completely outside our power of representation. Instead, according to the Kantian transcendental philosophy, the objectivity of our representation, that is to say, the appearances, is granted by unified representation under the concept of an object in general, which is determinable through the manifold
sorry, your mic. Just hold your microphone up again. It's really against your shirt. Yeah, there we go.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you. Thanks.
It can be argued also in the sense that this unified representation of them is precisely what Kant has in mind when he speaks about something that cannot be further intuited by us and remain equally or not to both the inner and outer senses. The necessary unity of all the appearances is not a representation that can be framed in the forms of our sensible intuition. It's not something actually given in the form of space and time, any other empirical object. Rather, it is a representation that we spontaneously produce due to the purely ideal character of these same forms. The transcendental objectivity of our representation, this is my thesis, is indeed the result of an original syntactic activity brought about by the spontaneity of our understanding. More specifically, it is an activity through which the same spatio-temporal form of our sensibility, namely the receptivity of our cognition, is in a certain sense determined as objective. In this way, everything that can be given into these forms is determined a priori in an objective form. But how this is possible according to Kant? We know that according to the transcendental idealism, the form of our sensible intuition in itself is nothing objective. This means that pure space and pure time considered in themselves can never be objects of our possible cognition or intuition in a proper sense. Gabriele, can you change the slide? Thank you. This is a passage taken from the first edition, the Critique of Purism. Here Kant say the mere form of intuition without substance is in itself not an object, but the merely formal condition of one as appearance, like pure space and pure time, which are to be sure something as the form for intuiting, but are not in themselves objects that are intuited, ens imaginarium. However, we also know that Kant claims that the same form of our intuition can be represented by the transcendental faculty of imagination, per se, so für sich, namely apart from the empirical matter that is actually given into it. Thank you, Gabriele. In this case, space and time are represented a priori not merely as form of sensible intuition, but also as intuition in itself, which contain a manifold, and thus with the determination of the unity of this manifold in them. Thus, even unity of the synthesis of the manifold outside or within us is also a combination with which everything that is to be represented as determinate in space or time must agree, is already given a priori, along with this intuition as condition of the synthesis of all apprehension. Can you change? Thank you. So here we have two quotes taken on two different handwritten reflections from Kant. And the first Kant asks, how are possible a priori intuition? He say, in no other way than by the fact that the form of intuition represented for themselves, so für sich, without matter. Without a given object of the sense. And the second is say a pure a priori intuition, but how is such an intuition possible? It's nothing more than the consciousness of its own receptivity, its own ability to receive representation, impression of things according to certain relation among themselves. This way of representing space and time originally shape the same receptivity. More specifically, the act of representing the pure forms of our intuition per se, so für sich, not an sich, determines the same receptive modes of our knowledge by introducing a priori that combination, Kant calls Verbindung, with which everything that is to be represented as determinate in space or time must agree, a condition of the synthesis of all apprehension. to Kant, in fact, Gabriele, can you change the slide? The sensible faculty of intuition is really only a receptivity for being affected in a certain way with representations. With relation to another is a pure intuition of space and time, pure forms of our sensibility, which insofar as they are connected and determinable in this relation, space and time, according to the laws of the unity of experience are called objects. The determination of the sensible form of our intuition is, as Kant say here, what a priori defines the general objectivity of our representations. And I think it is precisely this kind of determination that Kant has in mind when he talks about the transcendental object. If one adopts this perspective, in fact, it's not difficult to understand why, in the second edition of the Critique of Reason, Kant speaks of the transcendental object as the one to which we can ascribe the whole extent and connection of our possible perceptions, and at the same time as the intelligible cause of appearances in general. Kant, can you change, Gabriele? Kant writes, we can call the merely intelligible cause of appearances in general the transcendental object, merely so that we may have something corresponding to sensibility as receptivity. In this case too, I think that the concept of the correspondence to which Kant refers is not to be interpreted in the sense of external correlation between two different elements. On the contrary, the causality of the transcendental objects expresses a synthetic activity that springs spontaneously from the intellect, but finds its full and concrete expression in sensibility by conditioning the sense of its receptivity. So, in conclusion, I think that the transcendental objectivity of all our appearances corresponds to what we can call also the original objectification of the pure forms, so space and time, of our intuition. This is the result or the product of what Kant describes as the first application of the intellect to the object of our intuition, which is the ground of all the other possible applications. From this perspective, I think that the theory of transcendental objectivity shows us of Kant's assertion that the intuition in no way requires the function of thought, opens up a possibility that from a critical perspective must be entirely ruled out. On the contrary, I think it is through the constitutive correlation between the a priori elements of our knowledge, so in the complementary relationship between receptivity and spontaneity, that the Kantian transcendental model of objectivity emerged, forming the basis of its new ontology. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. So maybe I'll stop the sharing. So
yeah, thank you, Gabriele. I'm sorry for the problem with the
thanks.
PowerPoint and also with the microphone. And
yeah, so we have now time for questions. So please raise your hand. Yes, we have a question. If I read correctly, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you for putting this together, and thank you for the presentation, Jessica. I wanted to ask you about content and transcendental content. I'm thinking about the second edition of the deduction, and specifically B105. This is a very celebrated passage where it says that the same function of unity, etc. Maybe you remember this.
yeah,
He says the same understanding and indeed by means of the same very same actions through which it brings the logical form of the judgment into concepts by means of analytical unity, also brings the transcendental content into its representations by means of the synthetic unity of the manifold of intuition in general, etc. And then also in the B edition, the famous B137, where it says that an object, however, is that in the concept of which the manifold of a given intuition is united. So my question, Jessica, is whether for your thesis, which I think I agree with your thesis, main thesis, my question is whether you would consider conceptuality as such, as part of the explanation of what a transcendental object is. And if so, whether you have something to say about the presumed debate between conceptualists and non-conceptualists, if you have something to say about that. Otherwise, yeah, it was very interesting, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Efrain. It's correct, the name, Efrain. So thank you for your question. It's, of course, really big questions. So for my personal perspective, when Kant talk about the transcendental content, has in mind probably what I already said about the space and time as considered as intuition, also not only as form of our possible intuition. And the transcendental contents have to do more specifically with the fact that we can think. We can consider the form of our intuition, the form of space and time, from an idealistically point of view, as with a pure manifold in themselves. So the pure manifold is the pure form under which we can intuit objects. So next to another and one after another. This pure form is a pure manifold that I think, according to Kant, contained as a transcendental content in the concept, in the transcendental concept of objects. I don't know, is it understandable, my answer. About that conceptualist debate, I don't know, I think that for Kant, the conceptual part is more important than the other. I don't think that for Kant's concepts are more important than intuition, and more intuition are more important than concept. I think that at the beginning we need to think that they are together in a original synthetic unity, which of course we have no idea what's possible to know this unity, but it's necessary to presuppose their a priori unity. I mean, I'm not sure that the actual debate about the Kant intellectualism or not is it's go in the right direction. I don't know. It's not my field. So.
Karin?
Thank you for the questions. Very interesting.
Okay, thank you, Jessica, for your very interesting talk. So I have a question about one particular quote that you discussed, because for me it's still not clear how Kant can maintain that the transcendental object is the merely intelligible cause of appearances. So I'll try to explain why I find this very difficult to understand. Yes, because it's to me
Okay.
that the transcendental object is not something that is given. Yes, it is something that is being produced a priori by the human mind in order to provide us with a kind of notion of the feature, a determination that any object must possess in order to count as an object for us. Yes, I take this to be in agreement with your emphasis on determination. But this is something that is being produced. Whereas if we conceive of something as the cause of appearances, then all of a sudden we think of the transcendental object as something that in a way affects us. Unless you have a different way of explaining the passage concerning this merely intelligible cause of appearances. Yes, because it seems to me that according to many other passages, it's the human mind per se that that is active in this regard, and so could be said to use well, not the appearances in terms of their content, but the form in which something can appear to us. But so I'll leave it to you to clarify the point. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Another big question. So my position is that I don't think when Kant speak about the intelligible cause or intelligibile Ursache, is speaking about something that is outside that cause the representation. So I don't think that in Kant we have to do with the so-called Doppelaction or something like that. But the transcendental object, of course, is something that we produce a priori. And this is probably in this way that we can talk about the an intelligible form of causality. So we are the subject is the is the subject that made the objectivation of all the appearances. So talking about the intelligible cause is talking about the way in which we can understand the objectivity of our appearances. Because the other way, so the way in which we presuppose that there are something outside the power of our representation that cause, in the strict sense, the appearances is not understandable for us. I think that when Kant talks about the intelligible cause, it talks about the necessity to rethink this necessary connection between appearances, so our subjective representation, and the objects or their objectivity. This is a necessity. It's necessary that these appearances have to do with an object. So it's necessary to think that these appearances are not only our appearances, so are not only something subjective. So we need to think that they are there is a reference to something else. But it is impossible to us to think there is something outside the field of our possible cognition and the field of our possible, the power of representation. So I think that Kant calls the transcendental object intelligible cause and not the non-sensible cause, because he talks about the non-sensible cause regarding to the thinking itself, but he used the expression intelligible cause to refer to the transcendental object, probably in this way, namely to say we need to rethink the necessary relation to an object in terms there are that we can think that we can understand from a transcendental point of view. But I don't know if I answered to the question.
Okay, thank you very much. That was helpful.
Thank you.
Andrew has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on that. So, are you distinguishing? It seems like you have a sort of important role for mere thinking to play. Is that right? So, when we're thinking of the intelligible cause or the transcendental object, it's a thinking with the categories, but without intuition. Is that part of the view for you?
Can you repeat the question? I'm not sure if I really understood the
Yeah.
point.
So when you kept talking just now in response to Karin about thinking of the intelligible cause or the transcendental object, are you using that in a sort of technical sense? Like you're thinking, sorry, I use the word thinking again. That thought is this special way of conceiving of some of these intelligible or non-sensible objects that is it can be justifiable or it can be misleading. So are there constraints on what we think? And it has a certain kind of content, though not an intuitional content. I mean, is there a theory of thinking there that is part of the view?
Okay. There are scholars that say that there is an ambiguity about the transcendental object. So sometimes Kant say it is the object or representation. Sometimes he calls the transcendental object the intelligible cause.
Right.
So I think that these are only two different perspectives to talk about the transcendental object. So from one perspective, we can say that the transcendental object is the intelligible cause of the appearances. In this particular case, I think about the fact that the transcendental object is something that is determining through our categories or through the intellect. So I thought that we made the transcendental objectivity of appearances through an act of synthesis through our understanding. But of course, the understanding to made synthesis needs some content. And I think that this content is the pure form of our intuition in this case. So at the end, we can talk about the transcendental object also as the real object of our representation. So I don't know if I...
Yeah, no, that's helpful. So it's more than mere thinking. There is actually this kind of content coming from the formal structures themselves.
Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks. That was interesting talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. So if there are no other questions, we can all thank again Jessica for her interesting talk, and we can move to our second talk today, where the speaker is Lorenzo Sala. I don't see Lorenzo. Maybe, or maybe we can take a 5-minute break. I don't know if that's something you do normally.
It's certainly possible. Yeah. Do you want to just say?
Apologize. Sorry, I wasn't managing to open the.
Okay.
Again.
So I don't. We can also take a 5-minute break if you prefer. Yeah. So we reconvene at 5 and 7 minutes. So exactly 5 minutes. Okay. And so with Lorenzo talk. So I leave. So well. Yeah. Okay. So let's see if Lorenzo is there.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi. So, well, Karin is there too. So I think I can start introducing you, and the other will join in a second. So it's my pleasure to introduce Lorenzo Sala, who is currently postdoc at the University of Milan and has held position before that in Trier and at the Central European University. Lorenzo obtained his PhD at the University of Pisa. So today he will present a paper which bears the title Thinking in Images and Thinking in Science, Kant's Criticism of the Definition of Judgment of the Logicians in paragraph 19 of the B deduction. Thanks, Lorenzo, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks to you, Gabriele. First of all, I will try to share my screen and share the PowerPoint presentation. Oh, okay. Can you see this? Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Oh, wait, what's happening? All right. So, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers. It is for me a really great pleasure and an honor to be delivering a talk at this session of the Virtual Kant Congress. And I begin by apologizing because something bad happened with my PowerPoint. I closed it and I reopened it and I kind of got the older version. I mean, I think more or less everything is there. It's just not as aesthetically pleasing as I had made it into. But yeah, nonetheless. So, in my talk today, I'm going to focus on the context of the theories of judgment that were available when Kant was writing. In particular, my main focus is the criticism of the logicians, the definition of judgment that one finds in the paragraph 19 of the Transcendental Deduction in the B edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. I started getting into this problem because I was wondering who are these logicians, and even if one, like everyone says, understands that they were more or less the Wolffians, what was the debate on these topics like when Kant was writing? And I think that focusing on this concept is really useful in general, and today I am going to focus on a very specific application of this approach. In particular, many Kant scholars have noticed how this claim by Kant, that is, that judgment seems somehow to be necessary for us to be conscious of an object, raises some problem. There is a tension that this Kantian idea raises. And this is judgments seem to be something propositional, something that has a subject-predicate structure, for instance, whereas the doctrine of synthesis has to do, Kant's example, mostly have to do with things like drawing a line. So there seems to be a tension here, because arguing like Kant does that the synthesis is necessary and that this synthesis must be an activity of the mind, must be spontaneous, doesn't seem to be enough to ground the idea that judgments are necessary in order to do this. Of course, there are some scholars who have argued that this is precisely the case, but I mean, they have been criticized a lot, especially recently, by all those in the non-conceptualist, so to say, camp. And I am thinking even by moderate conceptualists. And in particular, many have taken this tension to be a genuine tension within Kant's text. And I mean, although there are some reasons to do so, I'm going to argue that taking into account the historical context of Kant's criticism of judgment might help mitigating a lot this tension. So a conclusions that many have drawn from here is that for Kant, there is a use of the understanding that is non-judgmental. And they do so because they begin from the assumption that judgment has this propositional structure like S is P. My conclusion is somehow sympathetic to them in as much as I agree with them that that the activity on the part of the mind that is for Kant required for us to represent an object doesn't have this propositional structure. However, as I'm going to contend, this does not mean that for Kant, our activity of representing an object does not require an act of judgment. This because judging was at the time not understood first and foremost as something having this particular predicative structure. So, in particular, I focus on Wolff's understanding of judgment, and I show, especially by focusing on the empirical psychology, that judgment was taken to operate first and foremost at an image-like level of intuitive cognition. I will then consider Tetten's criticism of the Wolffian notion of judgment. And I argue that although Kant's criticism of judgment is somehow different, this explains how Kant might have been led to assign a special role, the role of enabling us to have a representation of an object precisely to judgment. And the core idea is that judgment, also for Kant, can operate at this intuitive level, and is, although it's not reducible to images, and is something that allows us to turn images into images of objects. So, for understanding the Wolffian theory of judgment, I am going to focus on 3 points. First, on what is the ground, the ultimate ground of representing for Wolff, that is sensibility, and in particular, the ideas, the representation of sensibility. What is crucial about these representations is that they are images for Wolff, and in a really strong sense, almost a material sense. Wolff even compares ideas to images like statues and pictures. And secondly, as I have already anticipated, judgment was taken to operate first and foremost at this image-like level, and had to do with parthood relations between representations. Now we are going to see a bit more closely what this precisely means. So, judgment was taken to be the so-called second operation of the understanding, which are simple apprehension, judgment, and inference. All these operations of the understanding were in turn be taken to be exercised on ideas that are the products of the acts of perception. Now, something really important about ideas is that ideas represent their objects in as much as they resemble them. And this is a natural fact. Ideas just are like images. However, where, for instance, a picture, a painting is a material picture, ideas just are immaterial pictures, and they represent their object as such. They represent it in as much as they resemble it. In this, Wolff follows a very long tradition and takes ideas to be only individual representations. Ideas are the as images are always of individual things. We cannot have an image of a triangle in general, of triangularity in general, of blackness in general. We always have, for instance, the image of a black thing. Ideas were used for defining intuitive cognition, and this is not really informatively, but it is the cognition that we have through ideas, and was opposed to the symbolic cognition, the cognition that we have through science. The crucial difference is that ideas present us directly with their objects and represent it in as much as they resemble it. For instance, the painting of a horse represents the horse in as much as it looks like it. On the contrary, the sign, and in particular the word, the symbol horse, just refers to the horse, but has nothing to do with the horse apart of referring to it. Now, something really special about ideas, and it's not really easy to, it's not so to say intuitive about them, is that ideas, although we only have individual images, were said to contain in themselves already the universal representations, the notions which are for both the representation of genera and species were taken to be part of the ideas. So there is a sense in which something like blackness in general is already part, is a universal part of the image of the particular black object that I have on my desk. And the first operation of the understanding, apprehensio simplex, was taken to let us know these notions in the idea and to take place, first of all, at an individual, at this intuitive level. So thanks to the first act of the understanding, I can see the blackness of the black object that I have here on my table as a universal feature of it. And I can even form the representation of blackness as a general universal representation directly at this intuitive level. So I can abstract from the other parts of the representation, and in this way, by disregarding them, having an intuitive representation of the universal. So it's really important to notice that intuitive cognition and cognition of individuals do not strictly coincide. Intuitive cognition is not always about concrete objects. It also has to do with abstract objects and general objects. Now, this is really important and really important for what concerns judgment. So I made the example of the black object on the table and of how, via an act of simple apprehension, I get the representation of blackness out of this individual object. Now, judgment goes a step beyond this. What judgment does is representing, for instance, blackness, this notion, as part of the object from which I have abstracted it, or of another object I might like to consider. So, for instance, via judgment, I represent the blackness of the object that I have on the table as part of the image, of the individual image of the black object that I have on the table. So there are various points that are particularly important to point out here. So first of all, to affirm means, so in this context, to represent something as contained in something else, a representation as part of another. And this should not be understood at some abstract level, like containment is sometimes used in secondary literature. It is a really concrete sense. The notion is part of the image. Another important element to be kept in mind is that this intuitive way of operating with our representations was taken to ground the symbolic one. For instance, if we take the paragraph 329 of the Empirical Psychology, Wolff explains us how terms like subject, predicate, copula are all to be understood in relation to these intuitive relations. And another point that I'd like to stress is, if we go back quickly to the example, if you look here, Wolff brings as example of judgment, intuitive judgment, not only the iron is red hot, but also this object is longer than this other. And this, as we shall see, is really important in relation to thetans, as we are going to see later. What is interesting here, even if you think about Kant's criticism of judgment as a representation of a relation, is that for the Wolffians, for Wolff, a relation like being bigger than is not something that is captured by judgment. The relation being bigger than is captured by a notion, is something that we get by the first operation of the understanding. All that judgment does is presenting this relational property as inherent and as part of the objects that are considered. So, as I was saying, what is something that is going to be particularly important is that judgment, in its most fundamental sense, boils down to the representation of this intuitive relation, in particular, represented that a certain representation was part or not part of another representation of an image, first and foremost. The linguistic symbolic dimension is ultimately dependent on the intuitive one. It's parasitic on it. Now, I mentioned before Thetans' criticism of judgment. Before turning to it, it's useful to briefly focusing on how Thetans and Wolff have a different understanding of ideas. In particular, oh, what did I do? Sorry. How much time do I have?
So in general, so we said approximately 30 minutes. That means, well, we started almost at 10, so you have 15, let's say, a bit less maybe.
Okay, yeah, because it was going really quickly, and so I was thinking that I might slow down. But yeah, so as I was saying, Thethan has a different understanding from Wolff of the ideas. What is particularly relevant for us here in this context is that ideas are an image that is made by us into a sign of an object. This captures a crucial difference between Thetans and Wolff. For Wolff, ideas, like pictures, or at least as he also understands, as Wolff also understands pictures, naturally represent their object. Whereas for Thetans, this is not the case. And he even quotes, he refers to this blind man who was operated by Cheselden. He writes it with two S's, but it actually should be just one. But I quoted Wolff, but I quoted Thetans. So that's how he wrote it. And this man who, after a surgery, gained back the capacity to see, couldn't see in paintings images of things. He could only see multicolored surfaces. Images for Thetans do not, in themselves, as such, represent anything. Images require an activity on the part of the representative faculty in order to do so. So this is already a big difference if we think about, of course, if we think about how both Thetans and Kant understand the difference between sensibility and the understanding in terms of passivity and activity. there was, of course, more to do to this than what I'm talking about, because there is also the polemics against Reid about whether about whether our sensation have an intentionality, but this is of secondary importance for us here. What is important for us is that ideas do not represent, that images do not represent an object without an activity on the part of the mind. I was referring to Reid because of the term sign that Tetens uses, and in particular, because he does not believe that our ideas, our perception actually resemble the object. For instance, the blackness that we might see in an object is not something that resembles anything in the object. So for this reason, an idea is a sign, merely refers to the object, doesn't give back something that is, so to say, in the object by saying that, for instance, the object in question is black. So here I have quoted this criticism that Tetens raises against the logicians. And if you look at it briefly, it sounds a lot, it strikingly resembles Kant's criticism of the notion of judgment of the logicians in paragraph 19. However, there are some difference from what Kant does. Of course, the first one is that he does not assign to judgment, or at least does not use this criticism of judgment to argue that judgment has a special role in the representation of the object. What is interesting is that if one takes a Wolffian perspective, this might look like a misunderstanding of what Wolff and the logicians were doing, because if this criticism fundamentally says that the logicians are reducing all relations to what we have called in existentia, to these belonging or not belonging to another representation. And Tetens argue that there are many more relations than these. However, as we have seen, this was the Wolffian definition of judgment is about. Wolff was aware of these. Simply for him, the relations between objects were represented by the notions, and judgments merely represent whether these relational properties are or not in the idea that is under consideration, the idea of the object that is under consideration. Nonetheless, I believe that although Tetens' criticism of Wolff might be taken to be a misunderstanding from this point of view, it hits on something. That is, it is really difficult to see how all the relations that Wolff takes to be known intuitively in ideas can actually be known in ideas. I mean, if you think about the example about being longer, it's really easy to understand how something like this property can be represented intuitively. However, if you really think about this at the level of images, what it means to be a ground, what it means to be a substance, becomes much more difficult to understand. Of course, the Wolffian might have some resources in order to answer this, but I mean, Wolff doesn't actually write much about this. So Tetens was, although he kind of confuses what the Wolffian, so to say, understanding of judgment was about, nonetheless, he has something about the relations, about the Wolffian understanding of relations. And I mean, after this, Tetens goes on to classify different kinds of relation and explains how pretty much all of the relations that we can represent boil down to the list he makes. Something that kind of, again, sounds somewhat Kantian. A crucial difference, however, is that from Kant, however, is that like Wolff, for Thetens, judgment also articulates a pre-existent relation. Although this relation is not something that exists in the ideas, directly in the images, it is parasitic upon previous acts of the representative faculty. And so on the active part, so to say, of the soul. And from here, I mean, I believe that this, taking into account and having in mind this context, can be useful to mitigate the problems that I was referring to before. If one thinks about this background understanding of judgment, it doesn't become problematic to think that judgment operates at the level of images, and in particular, without having to make something like B in P, S B in P, without making it into an image. Nonetheless, judgment can indeed operate at the level of images. And Kant might have taken inspiration. I mean, this is not a really big and new conclusion, but I think this gives some substance. What I've shown gives some substance to this idea that Kant might have been inspired by Thetens for arguing that judgment in particular is what makes our images, which, as said, in themselves are not representations of objects, into images of something. So it is what makes images of an object. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorenzo, for a really clear and interesting talk. Yes, so please raise your hand. So I see Konstantinos Mofis has a question. So go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. It was very, very clear. I just have a question for your the slide before the conclusion, where you talk about the pre-existent relation. I was wondering if you could discuss this a bit more. And I'm thinking something like, does this pre-existence that you're pinpointing to refer to a let's say, linguistic, because you refer to propositions when you talk about the judgments. So with this pre-existent relation, do you want to mean that there is a non-propositional structure that somehow grounds the propositional form that the judgment has? Or is this, or do you want to take it somewhere else? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question, which actually points to something that I did not include in the presentation, but I should have probably included in the presentation. I just didn't discuss how also Thetens, like Wolff, shares the idea that judgments do not operate first and foremost at the linguistic level. And the relation is pre-existence, not only in as much as is something that, so to say, goes before symbolic cognition, although it is problematic to use it with respect to Thetens, in as much as for him images do not resemble the objects that they represent. But nonetheless, there is something, even if we drop the idea that images resemble their objects, there is still something that differentiates between how an image presents us with an object and a sign does. So it is not only something that is, so to say, pre-linguistic and pre-propositional, it's also something that is based on other acts of the mind. So the relation is pre-existence because there are some other passages in the Philosophische Versuche where Thetens analyzes what he calls, he has this really, I find it obscure way of speaking, but I think one can understand what he's pointing at. He says often that we perceive the movements of the mind as we move from an object to another, for instance, and thanks to thanks to this, thanks to this kind of, he draws a parallel here with Lockean inner sense. So via perceiving these acts of the mind that we do, that we entertain while that we enact while we entertain some ideas, we first form a general idea of the relation between these representations, and judgment makes clear this relation that we have between representation, a relation that, however, was first originated in other actions of the understanding, starting from moving from a representation to another. Sorry, it was a bit chaotic. I hope it somehow helps.
It helps. Thanks.
Okay, we have another question from Farhad. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much, Lorenzo, for this interesting talk. So I was wondering, and I was hoping to hear much more about the context transcendental deduction, because I was wondering what is the role of judgment specifically in the transcendental deduction. Yeah. So the passage you began with concerns the distinction Kant wants to make between the transcendental logic and general logic. Yeah. And he wants to argue that, well, here what is happening is that these concepts, these special concepts, categories, should determine the manifold of space and time, manifold of intuition. But that argument doesn't seem to rely on judgment. Judgment, an activity having a particular and trying to relate it to something universal. So Kant would make a distinction there between different empirical activities, or quid facti, a Lockean endeavor like abstraction, reflection, or comparison. Those activities that we find in judgment don't seem to be at play in the transcendental deduction at all. So yeah, so what's the place of judgment in the transcendental deduction for the passage you quote? And yeah, also I was also wondering if you could say something more about imagination as something in between conceptual thinking and intuitive thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. I mean, you touched upon many points, so I'll try to proceed in a more orderly fashion than what I did till now. So the role of judgment in the transcendental deduction. So what I was trying to show is that judgment should not be understood as being so far from synthesis, in as much as for Kant's contemporaries, judgment also had to do with intuitive relations. Of course, one might still think, and I mean, it makes a lot of sense to say that imagination, when drawing a line, when we are drawing a line, we are using our imagination in a way that has nothing, or at least which is not an act of judging. The role of judging would be, in my opinion, would be giving an intentionality to the images that we, so to say, draw. I don't know if this answers your question. And I mean, there was the quid facti, quid juri, comparison, reflection, and abstraction. Well, of course, reflection, comparison, and abstraction are declared by Kant to be necessary for the formation of empirical concepts. I think that, however, what is at stake in the transcendental deduction is much more the application of the pure concept of the understanding. And this seems to me to rely, I mean, if I have to think about a solution about this problem, I wouldn't go in the direction of comparison, reflection, and abstraction. I would look at the schematism chapter in order to see how we actually go from some intuitive relations like before and after to something that goes beyond the level of images, so to say. I'm using, like Wolf says, image in sensu latissimo, that is, in a sense, that is not reducible to picture, in the sense in which also a statue would be an image. So thank you again for your question. I hope I answered.
Thank you.
enough.
Eleanor? What? Oh, don't see any more. So a question, but you don't see-
Sorry, sorry, I mute myself.
Okay.
Thank you very much for this interesting topic. This is the very first time I read paragraph 19 in the B deduction in such details. Since this is my very first time reading this paragraph, I have trouble understanding, especially the last part of it. So the last part is starting from the example of bodies are heavy. I do not quite understand why Kant argues that the relation of a judgment is different from the relation in accordance with the laws of association. Why is a judgment? Why does a judgment have objective validity? As different from a mere association between the sensory intuition with the concept, whatever. Yeah, so I just have a difficulty trying to understand Kant's arguments here.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question that allows me to get into something that I did not include in the talk because I was afraid of not having enough time. And yeah, congratulations for someone who reads the paragraph 19 the first time. This is a really good question. So if I have to explain what you are puzzled about with reference to my talk, I would say think about what I was saying about, especially about the Wolffian understanding of judgment. We are having to do only with the being together of different parts of an image. So when we think about this, and when Wolff thinks about this, he refers to the piece of iron being red hot. However, we do not only have, it's easy to understand, I mean, it's all fun and games until we look at the red iron, but if I think that the red iron makes me remember about the experience when I was a child and I touched it and I was in a lot of pain. If I look at my whole representative state, in my whole representative state, there is indeed intuitively also this memory. If one just understands these, the relation articulated in judgment via inexistentia, like Wolff does, it's not so easy. I mean, one needs to add some details to explain how this wouldn't count as a judgment. Of course, I think a Wolffian might have a good answer to this, but for Kant, this is something important because it is precisely what judgment allows us to do. So of course, there is the problem. How do we know that our judgments are objective? But what I think Kant is doing here is he's not trying to justify, at least in this paragraph, that our judgments are objective. He's explaining us how judgments aim at objectivity. And in this, as this is what judgments are, they play a very special role because they are what allows us to represent and to distinguish between the heaviness of the body as something that is in the body and the association of imagination. For instance, my remembering about the experience as a child when I touched the red hot iron and I was in so much pain. I hope this somehow answers your questions.
Oh, yeah, especially the point that a judgment, the act of judgment aims at objectivity rather than it is objective itself. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thanks, Karin.
Yes, thanks, Lorenzo, for a very interesting talk. So I have a general question because I I think you rightly point out that Thetan's was important to Kant's own reflections on what it means to make a judgment. And so that he, in a way, prepared the path for Kant's account of judgment in the B deduction and elsewhere. But I wasn't sure whether the role that Thetan's played in this regard was connected to the point about images, because I think that that a more general feature of Thetan's approach that I think inspired Kant was the view that in order to understand what it means to make a judgment, we need to focus on the activity carried out by the subject. And so I think it is related to your point about the images, because according to Wolff, the images somehow, point to the things. But I think that even regardless of the problem of images, I think there is this transition to a bigger focus on the activity carried out by the subject, yes, and probably also in particular synthetic activity. Well, I see you're nodding, yes, so maybe
I very much agree with you. I mean, I do not assign a special, so to say, role in the genesis of Kant's ideas on the subject to Thetan's understanding of ideas and images. What was interesting for me is how Thetan's, in contrast to Wolff, argues that the activity of the mind, the higher cognitive faculty, is necessary for us to have a representation of an object. And of course, I pointed to ideas because this is more or less where he departs from Wolff, but I do not ascribe a special role, so to say, genetic role to this in Kant's development. I use this just to illustrate what I mean by saying that Thetan's introduces this idea, which is really relevant. Of course, Kant takes a different path. As I've argued, he focused much more on judgment than Thetan's, who assigns a parasitic role, a secondary role to judgment in this respect, or at least not as a strong role as Kant. So, I mean, I would agree with you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks to you.
Thanks. So, well, I see another question. Go ahead, Previn.
Yeah, Previn, carry on. Hi, Lorenzo. Thank you so much for your talk. I was kind of more interested in Kant than Thetan's and Wolff, and Kant's concept of judgment from what you were saying. And I wondered what you thought Kant was drawing from either Thetan's or Wolff. You seem to, I think, be saying that there was more Thetan's in Kant than there was Wolff. But what I was particularly interested in is you started off with this paragraph 19 as a challenge of the logicians. And I wondered what you thought is the difference in Kant between understanding and judgment and logic. So, Kant shifts in the B deduction from saying that the imagination in the A edition of the transcendental deduction, the imagination synthesizes into unity. By the B deduction, he's diminishing the imagination. He says, actually, it's the understanding that unifies the concepts with the manifold of the intuition. And so the understanding brings about the unity of the object. So we have the role of understanding in relation to concepts. Where do judgments come in, and how are they operating?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Prem, for your question. I just need a clarification of it, if I'm allowed to, because you said, you said something like, what is the difference between understanding and judgment?
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether you were referring to understanding as the faculty of the understanding, or understanding as in the act of understanding something.
As a faculty, yeah. So I'm thinking about the faculty of understanding, the faculty of judgment.
Yeah, I thought so, but I just wanted to be sure.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for your question. So, I mean, Kant often defines the understanding as a faculty of judging. And this has raised many problems for Kant scholars because, as you correctly point out, Kant says, you know, it is the understanding that somehow does the synthesizing in the B edition. How do we synthesize it? Seems to draw lines, to do things like that, forming images. What does this have to do with judgment? And what I was trying to show is that this conflict is apparent and depends on our presuppositions on judging as post-Freudians, etc. We take judging to have to be something propositional first and foremost, whereas Kant's contemporaries didn't do so. They took judgment to have to do with images, to something really similar to Kantian intuitions. So in this way, there's this gap that begins to close. I still believe that drawing an image and judging about it are two different things. So there are many details that we should, so to say, explain about the division of labor between sensibility and understanding in the production of the image of an object. To put things quite briefly, I believe that something like drawing a line is still an operation of the imagination. What judgment adds to this is taking this image as the image of an object, something that represents something. And this is something that happens at an intuitive level. It's a taking an image to be the representation of an object. Does this answer your question?
Because how do you judge an idea? How do you apply? I mean, you could argue, okay, relation, modality, quantity, quality, those are all empirical, but judgment. Well, do you judge ideas of reason as the logic of illusion? Like when in the dialectic, Kant says reason contradicts itself, it has antinomies, it has paralogisms, and it carries the logic of illusion. Okay, it contradicts itself inherently in reason. And this is one of the problems of reason's ideas. Who is making that judgment? Which faculty, I mean, is making that judgment?
The production of the ideas is a work of reason. The judgment God is immortal is brought about by the understanding. Why is this like forming an image? No, not at all. But saying that judgment has a role in interpreting this image of the glass as, for instance, an object doesn't imply that this is the only role of judgment. I mean, even if you take the traditional views on judgment, if you take Wolff, he takes that our mind, even without talking only about Kant, he believes that our mind is limited. So our intuitive cognition is very limited. And thanks God, we have words that allow us to think also things that we cannot know intuitively. So judging is neither for Kant nor for his contemporaries is limited at this image-like level. Goes also beyond that, takes other forms. So what I was saying was not saying judgment is this and only that. What I was saying is that scholars tend to forget that judgment was also this, and that this was, for the pre-Kantians at least, actually its fundamental form. Remembering this, taking this into account, can help us mitigating many exegetical problems about the transcendental deduction. So I could say that the discontinuity between Kant and the pre-Kantians is interesting, but for us today, seeing the continuities might be even more productive for understanding Kant.
Thanks for bringing it back to the transcendental deduction. And but I think I would like to have like 3 hours with you about the faculties. But thank you very much.
Thanks to you.
Thanks, Lorenzo, again for great talk and also very interesting discussion. So I think we can close our session today, and I invite all to stay for the informal part that will start after we close the recording. And yeah, and thank you. And so I now, yeah, I think Karen wants to say something.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Gabriele. So I would also like to thank all speakers and Gabriele, the chair, and all participants for being here. So maybe one more applause. I think it was a great session, and I'd also like to mention the next session. So we go from Italy all the way to the US, and on May 17, we'll have a session organized by the North American Kant Society with 3 talks by the winners of the North American Kant Society Prize. Yes, so I hope to see many of you over there.
Yeah, I would like to thank again the organizers and all those who attended.
Okay.